I have always been fascinated by urban exploration, the act of visiting and documenting abandoned places. I have seen many different sites over the years, but there is one that stands out in my memory as the most horrifying and dangerous one. I call it Satan's Castle, and this is the story of how I encountered it and the cult that was using it for their dark rituals. It was back in the late spring of 2000 when I was dating a guy who worked as a roofer. He was the one who first spotted the place from a distance, while he was working on a house in Oro-Medonte, Ontario. He told me he saw a stone wall that looked like the remains of a castle on a hill, surrounded by trees. He also noticed a large barn, a carriage house, and a stable nearby. He knew I loved exploring abandoned places, so he suggested we go check it out on the weekend. I agreed, and we made plans to drive there on Saturday. We packed some gear, snacks, and drinks, and set off on the hour-long drive. The place was not easy to find, as it was hidden from the main road by a long driveway and a dense forest. We had to park our car on the side of the road and walk the rest of the way. As we got closer, we could see the stone wall more clearly. It was all that was left of the main house, which had burned down years ago, leaving only the outer shell. Through the basement window, we could see an old stove among the rubble. The place looked like it had been a beautiful and elegant home once, but now it was a ruin. We decided to explore the other buildings first, before going inside the wall. I was very curious and excited to see what we would find. My boyfriend was less enthusiastic, but he followed me anyway. I didn't want to waste any time looking at the outside of the buildings. I wanted to go inside and see what secrets they held. The first building we entered was the barn. It had 2 floors, and we checked both of them. The upper floor was empty, except for some hay and dust. The lower floor, however, was a different story. As soon as we went down the stairs, we felt a chill in the air. The basement was dark and damp, and it smelled like rot. There was graffiti on the walls, but not the usual kind. It was satanic symbols and words, painted in red. There was a knife on a table, stained with what looked like blood. There was an altar with black candles and a bottle of liquid that smelled like blood. There was a cage made out of the silo, with chains and hooks inside. It was obvious that this place had been used for some kind of satanic sacrifice, and we were not alone. My boyfriend wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, but I convinced him to stay and explore the rest of the buildings. I told him it was probably just some kids messing around, trying to scare people. I didn't think it was a big deal, but I was wrong. Our next stop was the stable at the back of the property. I was so eager to see what was inside that I didn't listen to my boyfriend's protests. I opened the door and was hit by a wave of stench. It was the smell of rotting flesh, and it was everywhere. The stable was full of dead animals of all kinds and sizes. Dogs, cats, rabbits, coyotes, foxes, and more. They had been mutilated and tortured in horrible ways. Some had their eyes gouged out, some had their limbs cut off, some had their throats slit. Some were skinned, some were burned, some were gutted. It was the most gruesome sight I had ever seen, and I felt sick to my stomach. My boyfriend grabbed me and pulled me out of there, saying that we had to leave right then and there. He said that this was not some harmless prank. This was some serious shit. He said that whoever did this was sick and dangerous, and we had to get away from them. I agreed, but there was one more building I wanted to see on our way out. It was the carriage house next to the barn. He said no way, we were not going in there, and he stormed off up the hill, back to the main house. He assumed I would follow him, but I didn't. I snuck off and took a quick peek in the carriage house. It was empty, nothing interesting at all. It was actually a good thing that I did that, because if I hadn't, we wouldn't have seen them coming. They would have ambushed us as we were walking up the hill, and who knows what they would have done to us. The first one I noticed was an adult male with a baseball bat. This one is from a female listener who was 19 years old when this happened. She loves camping, and whenever she and her friends came home from college, they would fill up their cooler with beer, grab some gear, and have fun in the outdoors. Unfortunately, when she was at school, none of her sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with her, so she would often miss camping. One day, the weather was too good to waste, so she decided to go on a solo camping trip. She grabbed some of her gear, hopped in a car that she borrowed from a buddy of hers, and drove to a spot that was secluded, but within a safe distance to civilization, in case she needed to run and get help. Camping also creeps her out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also part of the thrill for her. It's the same reason that people read these stories. It's fun to be scared. She set up a small camp and got a fire going. She didn't bring much food, but she was enjoying herself, reading and exploring the area. She got the feeling that she was being watched, and she stopped dead in her tracks. She heard a twig snap to her right, and then she saw a doe bolt away from about 100 feet in front of her. She laughed at herself and went back to the camp with an armful of wood that she had gathered. She kept freaking herself out, hearing sounds just outside of the ring of light cast by the fire. She always gets inside her head, so she shrugged it off and kept whittling at a stick that she had been playing with. Around one, she decided to go into her tent and turn off the lantern. She had been drinking beers and smoking cheap cigars in the most unladylike fashion. Another reason she likes camping is that she can act however she wants, so she passed out relatively quickly. Around 2, she started hearing footsteps. They sounded light and timid. She thought to herself that it was a deer or another animal, more likely a raccoon, because she had probably left some food out. She was still on guard, and after 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, she heard a rubbing noise and the tent fabric was being pushed in a bit. She doesn't know how she didn't soil her sleeping bag, but she just sat there, paralyzed with her knife in her hand. She wanted to stab the knife through the tent fabric, but she was still holding out hope that it was some of her buddies from a frat joking with her. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it all stopped. She was starting to feel slightly more secure because daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but she sure as hell wasn't going to sleep. Suddenly, at about 4, she realized she should put boots on, so that if anything did happen, she would be ready to go. After having stayed up and keeping alert a little while longer, her friend's car alarm went off. She freaked the hell out and ran out of the tent. She got about 2 steps before something grabbed her around the mouth. She opened her mouth to scream, but instead, the person's pinky finger slipped between her teeth. She had heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes, and in her case, she just clamped down. And there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous, but his finger popped off. He screamed, pulled his hand away, with the missing digit falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill she was camping on. She took off to the right, quickly, in the opposite direction. She must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house she ran to. A little sorority girl in a wife beater, boxers, and steel-toe boots.